We are continuing today with Hunting for Hidden Gold by Franklin W. Dixon. Chapter 7, A Rooftop Struggle. The wind suddenly died down, and in an eerie silence, Frank and Joe heard the tinkle of the piano keys coming from the deserted dance hall. Joe murmured, "Here's one mystery we can solve tonight. Let's find out what goes on in there." "Right." Moving lightly over the wooden sidewalk, the boys approached the dance hall entrance. The weird, tuneless music stopped. Frank and Joe looked at each other. "Maybe we've scared the spook away," Frank whispered half-jokingly. As if in answer, the music started once more. This time both the treble and the bass keys of the piano sounded. Quickly, the Hardys drew flashlights from their jacket pockets and stepped inside. The searchers snapped on their flashlights and played the beams around the interior. The music stopped again. The room was sparsely furnished with a few rickety tables and chairs heavily coated with dust. Ancient oil lamp chandeliers festooned with cobwebs dangled from the ceiling. At that moment, the piano resumed its tinkling. Outside, the wind howled and the shutters banged. "Boy, this place is really creepy," said Joe with a shudder. Frank gripped his brother's arm. "Look there." The boy's light now fell on the raised dais at one end of the room. On it stood a battered upright piano. The Hardys stared in astonishment as the music continued. "The piano's playing itself!" Joe exclaimed. Quickly, the brothers crossed the room and Frank lifted the top of the old piano. He shone his flashlight inside. There was a sudden squeaking and twanging of wires. "For Pete's sake," he burst out, as several rats jumped out of the piano, scurried along the floor, and ran away. The boys laughed heartily. "There goes Tinker's ghost music," Frank said. "Talented rats," Joe grinned. Suddenly, from the direction of the doorway, they heard the sidewalk creak. The boys whirled as a low, flat voice snarled, "You kids have been asking for it." Frank and Joe barely had time to glimpse a head, masked like a ghost-like hood with eye holes above the swinging doors. Then a gloved hand jerked into view, clutching a short-barreled revolver, the thumb cocking back the hammer. There was a spurt of flame. A bullet whistled across the room and thudded into the piano. The Hardys dived from the dais, snapping off their flashlights and crashing into tables and chairs below. As the echoes of the shot died away, Frank picked up a broken chair and hurled it into the direction of the gun flash. There was a grunt as the chair connected. Then the Hardys could hear the gunman's feet scraping across the floor. He was stalking them in the darkness. The boys separated instinctively to divide his attention. Frank crept off to the right and Joe to the left. Suddenly, Frank sprang to his feet. In 2 long strides, he reached the window and leapt through it into the darkness outside. There was no glass in the window, but Frank's weight had carried away the cross pieces of the frame. He landed feet first. A moment later, he saw a figure struggling through the window, grunting with effort. The masked man. Frank dashed around the corner of the dance hall, and when he reached the back, he skidded to a halt at a high fence that was blocking his way. He heard the gunman's steps behind him, so he vaulted the fence and leapt in a heap on the other side. The gunman leapt a moment later, and Frank held his breath. He could see the man silhouetted against the dim light of the sky, then darting off into the darkness. Frank jumped up, dashed into a ramshackle building that stood next to the dance hall. But the hooded man evidently had spotted the boy's move, for Frank heard steps pounding in pursuit. Without hesitation, he ran through the front door and out onto the slippery, snowy sidewalk. There was no time to find cover. The gunman was hot on his heels. In desperation, Frank ran straight down the open street. As he sped along, he wondered what happened to Joe. Flinging a glance over his shoulder, Frank saw the hooded gunman raise his arm to fire. The bullet whistled past Frank's head and ricocheted off a metal store sign. Just ahead to the left was the old hitching rail. Frank recalled that it stood in front of the ghost town's abandoned hotel. He cut across the street and dashed into the narrow side yard of the hotel. A flight of outside stairs slanted up the wall of the building. Frank mounted the steps 2 at a time. At the top was a rickety wooden balcony which sagged under Frank's weight as he stepped onto it. Now what? The young detective wondered. Had he worked himself into a corner? Frank's heart thudded as he heard the gunman's footsteps on the wooden walk below. Just out of reach, the overhanging roof of the hotel loomed in the blackness. There was no other place to go, so Frank leapt up for the edge. His fingers dug into the broken shingles and he swung himself onto the rear slope of the snow-covered roof. Meanwhile, the hooded gunman had already started up the stairs. Frank heard his clattering footsteps as he reached the balcony platform. Then he saw the man's hands appear, clutching the edge of the roof. A moment later, his head rose against the night sky. He was pulling himself up for a shot at close range. Frank fought down a surge of panic. He had wriggled some distance away from the eaves, but now he must work his way back and try and overcome his assailant before the man could pull his gun. Frank slithered towards him across the slippery shingles. By now, the man had one leg up over the roof and was groping for the gun in his coat pocket. I won't be able to reach him in time, Frank thought grimly. Just then he heard steps racing up the stairway to the balcony. The gunman heard the footsteps too. He paused and looked down, and then managed to extract the gun from his pocket. An instant later, Frank saw his body jerk, and the man clutched the roof edge as if to brace himself. Evidently, the newcomer was pulling the gunman's other leg, trying to dislodge him. The hooded figure suddenly gave a tremendous heave upward, and the next moment was free, sprawling full length on the roof. Frank, by now, was close enough to grab the man's coat sleeve. The gunman threw up his arm and yanked it free, but the force of his action caused him to lose his grip completely. His gun arced through the air, hit the rear part of the roof, and bounced off. The man, meanwhile, was rolling and slipping rapidly towards the edge. Frank saw him clutch frantically for the gutter. He caught it, hung suspended for a moment, and then swung over to the downpipe and slid down to the ground. Frank, are you all right? It was Joe. I'm okay. As quickly as possible, Frank wriggled towards the stairway side of the roof and dropped safely onto the balcony platform. The Hardys glanced over the railing. Below, the hooded figure was groping hastily, trying to find his gun. Come on, Joe, let's get him this time, Frank urged, and the boys went bucketing down the stairs. Hearing them, the man gave up his search and dashed off into the darkness. Their quarry was some distance ahead when Frank and Joe approached the inhabited part of Lucky Lode. But the town was so dimly lighted, it was hard to keep the figure in view, except for his white hood. The next moment, the boys lost sight of him completely as he disappeared into the deep shadows around the general store. Nonetheless, Frank and Joe dashed in pursuit. Reaching the store, they saw no one in front, so they ran around the back. The area was hidden in almost total darkness. Frank stiffened suddenly. Did you hear something? He muttered. Yeah, sounds like a door closing. Come on. The boys ran around the front of the store. There were no lights showing. Joe grabbed the doorknob and shook it. The door was locked. Frank knocked. The sound echoed loudly in the quiet of the deserted street. The boys waited a few moments, and when no one answered, Frank repeated his knock. He kept hammering at the door. At last there was a response. From inside came a call. Just a minute! Hold your horses! Presently a light showed, and a moment later Jim Burke came to the door, holding an oil lamp. He had pulled on his bathrobe over his long underwear. Well, what's all the excitement about? From the look on his face, Burke was not pleased at being disturbed at so late an hour. Frank explained why they had roused him. Nope. Burke's expression was puzzled as he shook his head. I haven't seen or heard anyone, except you two. Could the fellow we're after have slipped in your back door? Joe asked. Not a chance, Burke replied. I sleep right in the back room. As Burke spoke, the front door suddenly burst open and Bob Dodge strode in out of the windy darkness. Frank and Joe stared at him. Dodge's outer garments were wet with snow, and his coat sleeves and trouser legs were covered with burrs.